Hello, everyone. Welcome to King Trumpet Mushroom Study in Gouache, Part 1. I am your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and this is Part 1 of a two-part class that will continue in 2 weeks from today at this time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Wednesday, the first week of April. So we've got a bit of a break in between this two-part class. And so tonight we will get started with sketching and laying down the first layer or so on our King Trumpet Mushroom Study in Gouache. And we'll see how far we get. I'm hoping we'll have something that looks like the image that you saw when you signed up for the class tonight, with a little wash of color in the background and maybe a little bit of color on the mushrooms themselves, or we may get a little further. So we'll see how far we get. So we have 90 minutes, so that's a good amount of time. And I'll go ahead and switch to my tabletop view and we will get started. We'll go over supplies. Okay, so here's the finished product. This is what we might have by the end of class number 2 in a couple of weeks. Don't forget to tag your work with those hashtags, Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes, and you can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art. And here is some of my personal work from a few years back that I have on my business cards here. I'm also on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art. And I have some independent classes that I am doing on Zoom that you might be interested in. If you go to my Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art and then click on my link tree that is in my bio on Instagram, you'll see I've got sign up for my upcoming Michaels classes. If you're in the Austin area, I've got in-person classes at the Contemporary Austin at Laguna Gloria. And then I also have this online draw club that I'm doing, and I'm really excited about this next series of draw club sessions. And several of you have been joining me for those, so make sure you check those out if you haven't already. All right, so tonight we are using gouache, which we have used quite a bit lately, actually, in recent months. We had a class at the beginning of the year on getting started with gouache, gouache painting 101, I believe it was called, if you want to search for that one on YouTube. And then we have more gouache classes coming up in April. So I actually have a little sketchbook here with the class that's coming up in April. We'll be doing this little gouache study of true light, black and white. Well, I guess it's not true light, but it's black and white, like it would actually appear, and then the inverted light version of a landscape photo. So that's coming up, also using gouache. And in all of these gouache classes, I'm listing several options for you that you can purchase through Michaels. And I'm using this Artist Loft Jelly Gouache, which is a fun set that the good folks at Michaels sent me a while back. And if you don't have this exact same set of gouache, that is totally fine. You can use any other gouache that you have, but gouache is very unique. It's not the same as watercolor, so you definitely want some kind of gouache to be able to follow along, but you can definitely do this in watercolor as well. Just all the things that I'm saying about gouache will not apply to watercolor, but I put a few different options for gouache paint on the supply list, so I didn't expect you to have all of those, just one of those sets or any set of gouache. Okay, and then we're using a few different paint brushes here. So I have basically, I mean, you can have the exact same brushes as me if you were able to go out and get those, or through the Michaels website or in a Michaels store. But if you just have a flat brush, a round brush, maybe don't even necessarily need the filbert, although the filbert would be nice. But just a round brush, a flat brush, and a liner brush. Those are kind of my trifecta, I always say. If you have those three, you can get pretty far in a class. And I put a few different sizes, round brushes on there. So I believe I had a size 6 and a size 12. I maybe don't even have those exact same sizes here. So those are just suggestions, but basically a couple of round brushes and definitely a good liner brush like this one is what you're gonna want. And then we've got a set of Faber-Castell pencils, although I'll probably just be using one pencil to sketch our king trumpet mushrooms to get some sketching in before we lay down the foundation for our study in gouache. I've got a Faber-Castell eraser, and then I've got a pad of Arches, cold pressed paper. I'm actually going to be using a bigger sheet of paper than what I have this example on, because I happen to have 10 by 14 on this pad. So it doesn't have to be the exact same paper size, but you definitely want some watercolor paper that is at least 140 pound. If you're working with mixed media paper, that is also fine, but preferably you're going to want something with a nice, heavier weight, like 140 pounds, so that we can put a couple of different layers on it. But this would work on mixed media paper as well, if that's all you have. And then we've got some blue tape. Let's see, wow, so many supplies. And then a palette, a water cup, some paper towels, and I believe that is it. And then a sketchbook. And I think I put a larger sketchbook on the supply list, but I'm going to work on this smaller Canson sketchbook because that's the one I had handy. Are there any questions about supplies before we dive in here? You'll say, were there any questions that you were seeing jumping out at you that you weren't able to answer about supplies?
Yes, I just posted it on the chat in case you didn't see it. But basically, Kathleen asked, is a graphite aquarelle 2B a good sketching pencil to use for this project? Does it bleed when we use the paint?
So yeah, the water soluble graphite is definitely going to bleed when you add water to it. So I wouldn't recommend that for this one unless you were gonna just use the water soluble graphite and maybe not mix it with the paint. Or it might be kind of nice to use it as towards the end to like add these gray values in there that I have on the last layer. That might be kind of nice, although we're going to go kind of thick with the gouache. So if you do something like that, kind of I don't know how that might look, but if you're going to use it as like your foundational sketching tool, then yeah, it will definitely bleed. So I would not recommend that. That's a good question. Okay, and then somebody's wanting me to zoom out a little bit. I can do that, but then it might be kind of far away when I start getting into the details here, but just let me know if you want me to zoom back in. Sometimes one person's request is not everybody's request for things like that. All right. So I'm going to set this aside and we're going to get started just sketching our king trumpet mushrooms. So I included these reference images on the supply list. We've got the, I kind of put some filters on these to change it changed the color of the mushrooms themselves. So as we get into this, mostly I did that because sometimes people get, I don't know, I thought it was a little more interesting. It made the shadows more dramatic and I kind of liked it with this like sepia color on it, but this one is more like the true colors of the mushrooms. And then this one has a little bit more of this like vintage sepia feeling to it. And that was definitely the one I was painting from because I just liked those sepia tones. So if you know, as you're mixing colors or as we're mixing colors together, I'm going to show us how to get closer to these sepia hues. But obviously, the color of the mushrooms in these other pictures is a little different as well. It's a little more grayish of a brown and not quite as warm. So I definitely warmed it up. But then I felt like the background was making it hard for me to, I'll be honest, I didn't like what my cutting board looked like. I like touched up the cutting board to like take out something over here. And then I like ended up cropping off part of the mushrooms. And then I was like, oh, I know, I can just pull the mushrooms completely out of the image. So that way we can get the full view. So we'll use this picture for sketching the mushrooms themselves, since we can see the detail on like this one over on the right. And then whenever it comes to painting it, we can use this one, and we'll definitely use, you know, a combination of these for the shadows. And this was the more unedited picture, so without the cropping or anything, so that you could see what I cropped out. So, you know, full disclosure there on why I did that with so many different pictures and how they could all be helpful to us. So we'll use all of them at some point here in the mix. So first thing I want to talk about is the contours of the mushrooms themselves, the 3 dimensions of them. And also we'll do a couple of little thumbnail sketches to just think about this like overall composition. Also, I want to encourage you to make this your own. I always do this when we have a class like this where we're kind of following along and painting something together. And there are opportunities to make it your own in some way, like you could maybe do more the true color of the mushrooms, or especially the background. So if you wanted to do a green background, like my cutting board in the reference image, that might be kind of cool. You could do a blue background, you could do gray and make it really, you know, kind of change the whole vibe of it. If you made it gray, it would be more neutral. Anyway, just an idea to be thinking about. I did this pinkish purple background, but maybe I'll change it whenever we get to the point when we're adding the background in today. Okay, so first of all, let's just start. Let's do some thumbnails to start. So thumbnails are little sketches that we do in our sketchbook to, oh, and I just realized I grabbed that giant 2B pencil. I'll use my little one since that was not on the supply list. In April, I'm going to be using that big 2B pencil a lot for those April classes. So we're just drawing little boxes here, and I don't know why I just did a square. We need rectangles for these.
Adrienne, sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure if you can do something about the exposure of the image, because we can't see your strokes at all right now.
Yeah, I'm drawing really light right now. I'll make my lines darker as we go. That's just one of those things when it comes to Zoom is that's challenging. It washes out light graphite lines, and starting with light pencil lines is a great way to just, you know, find the shape that you're trying to draw, but I'm going to draw them darker so that everybody can see.
Okay, awesome. I think we can see it a bit better now, so thank you.
Yeah, that was just, you know, that's a good reminder to everybody that the first line that you draw does not need to be the perfect one, and drawing nice and light makes it easier for you to erase. And but I will turn my light down a little bit. Sometimes having my iPad on the screen at the same time also messes with the light, so that's why I'm trying to keep it off to the side. Okay, so we're just starting with a small little box in our sketchbook, and we're just going to do a quick little, you know, practice sketch, rough sketch of it to get the basic idea of the composition. So, and we want to be able to squeeze all of these mushrooms in there. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big mushrooms, but then the one on the right has 2 little ones on it as well. So there's a total of 7 mushrooms. Okay, so the easiest way to ensure that you're making space for all 5 of these when you're sketching is to just go ahead and like count to 7. I said 5 because there's 5 big ones. So maybe make 5 little half circles here at the top just to get the spacing. These 2 on the right are really close to each other. They're kind of hugging and touching. So, and as I'm doing that, like right away, I'm realizing that I didn't quite make enough room here. So that tells me that I need to draw them a little bit differently in order to squeeze them in. So maybe make them a little smaller. So this is just a rough sketch to troubleshoot any issues that we might have throughout the drawing process, and also to recognize the size differences here. So I'm drawing really light right now. I'm not going to press down on my pencil and make my lines darker until I've found the spacing that I'm looking for. So I'm just, if you can't see my lines yet, be patient with me, please. It's just, those of you who have been coming to these classes all the time know the struggle between trying to teach you to draw lightly at first and making sure everybody can see my drawing, which is not always gonna happen right away. Okay, so I feel like I've got my spacing for where those little half circles need to be. So now I can start to press down a little more and start to sketch in just the rough shape of the mushrooms. And we're not worried about perfection at all here. We're just thinking about the overall composition and spacing and the just understanding of how big they all need to be in relationship to each other in order to fit in on the page. And doing this on a small scale will prepare us to be able to do it on the bigger paper, to be mindful of the size and relationship of all of the mushrooms to each other. So right now we're not worried about anything other than just the vague idea of the shapes and how they fit in on a rectangle in relationship to each other. And if you end up changing the size of some of them, making some of them a little smaller or in a different position, you know, that's totally fine. I definitely did that in my other example. We just don't want them to run off the page. Like this one's kind of running off the page. So that's good information for me to have, that I need to not make these so big that this one ends up squeezing over and going out of the frame. Although maybe you're okay with it going out of the frame if that happens to you. So thumbnail sketches are just a good way to troubleshoot and work out all these kinks that can happen. Okay. And then now that we have just this little rough sketch, I want to talk about the 3 dimensions of this form and how we can make them feel 3-dimensional. So I talk about contour lines quite a bit in every drawing class that I've had with Michaels for coming up on 3 years now. And we had a nice class that you might refer back to in December if you search on YouTube for understanding value and contour lines. It was a class where we drew a set of limes, like lemon and limes, but just the limes. And we drew the lime in 4 different orientations and noticed how the contour lines changed in regards to the different directions that the limes were pointing. So contour lines are the lines that tell us about the elevational curve or structure of a form, it's all of the lines that describe that form, not just the outer line. So if I were talking about the contour lines of my hand, it would be every line across the surface of my hand. Okay, so with the mushrooms, we've got, I'm just having issues with my iPad. I thought I think my kids changed the setting on the iPad to where it keeps going to the screensaver constantly. I keep having to put in the passcode. So we've got a cylinder basically, and on a cylinder, let's say we're looking at a cylinder that we're looking up at a cylinder. So we're seeing the bottom of it, which on some of these mushrooms, we can see the bottoms of them. So that's appropriate. But so that means that we've got a curved horizontal axis, and the curve is curving upwards on the cylinder that we're looking up at. If I was looking down at a cylinder, then the curve would be going in the other direction. So depending on the viewer's eye level, that curve can change. So here we're looking down, here we're looking up. On these mushrooms, some of them, we can see the tops of them. So it does feel kind of like we're looking down at them. And then others, it feels more like we're looking up at them. So that really affects the contour line. So like on this one, it feels like there's a curve up. On the cylinder, it would just be straight vertical lines because the cylinder is straight on the sides, mostly, this little sketchy cylinder that I drew. But on the mushroom, it's curved. So that means our vertical axis curves with the curve of the side of the mushrooms. And yeah, y'all are just gonna have to bear with me. Classes where we only use graphite, that exposure that happens with the light is so tricky. I've got some classes coming up that I'm planning with graphite, and I'm like, ooh, that's gonna be an issue. But you know, the more we work on the sketch, or the more I work on the sketch, and the darker I make the lines, the less that happens. It's just the zoom is looking for the light and looking for what to focus on. And since my lines are so light in the early stages here. Okay. One comment about that, and I keep focusing on it now. All right, so then our value is also following these curves. So that means our shadows across the mushrooms are also going to be on these curves. On the cap of the mushrooms, there's going to be a curve with whatever direction the cap is. So if it's kind of dipped down, like we're looking down at it, then there's going to be a curved line. And it's just following those edges. So you have to notice what the edges of the mushroom are doing. Okay, and then up here on this one, we've got a really interesting contour happening. So it's kind of like a little hat here, little cap, little chapeau, and then we've got this like vortex in the center that's happening, like a little whirlpool. So we can kind of sketch the top of the whirlpool like that, but then we want to understand that inside of here, we've got this sort of curved situation happening. And that class on contour lines that I just talked about will help you if you're struggling with this to see those contours on the cap of the mushroom. And then same thing with all of these, we're just looking at where that horizontal axis is. So if it seems like it's kind of more curved down, then you can think about a curve down. If it feels like it's more curved up, I'm going to let y'all kind of do your own work here on these, because I feel like either way, it's going to make sense as long as you've got, really, you don't have to draw these lines on our final thing, on our final painting here. It's just the understanding of these contours are going to help us know where to put the paint. Like having our paint follow these curved paths is going to make them feel more three-dimensional. professional. And if this is kind of next level for you, having those contour lines in there, then you're just going to do your best when it comes time to paint them, if you're still struggling to understand this. And then on these little ridges here underneath the caps of the mushrooms, what my daughter calls the book pages, these are also following what the vertical lines are doing. So if no other part of the contour lines makes sense to you, I want you to really study this part of it. So I'm going to zoom in on this part of it and sketch one of these mushrooms a little bigger here, because I think we're starting to get the idea of where I'm going. I'm not going to do, you know, a detailed contour line sketch for all of them, but I'm going to sketch just this one big mushroom on a separate piece of paper here. Please be patient with me as I sketch it in, and then I'll darken my lines. So I'm just getting the basic idea of this bigger mushroom in here. So I want to really zoom in on those book pages, we'll call them. Okay, so we've got this little kind of hamburger bun lid right here that has a curve like this. And it definitely kind of radiates out and curves in a different direction on either side. So noticing that, you can actually see ridges on there that look that way, but it's these that I want to focus on, these lines. So they're kind of straight in the middle, and then they radiate or fan out, but they also follow the curve here. So they, like this moment right here where there's this sharp turn in the 3 dimensions. We're seeing something like this to those ridges there. And then something like this. That's kind of the main path that these ridges are taking. And then the horizontal axis is like this. It's just following that curve, but it also follows this little ridge over here too. So just making your lines and your value and your painting, everything that we're going to add later, we'll come back to this sketch if we need to illustrate where these lines are going. But really, I just want you to have this understanding of these contours mostly. These are the ones that are going to make a difference when we are painting them in. So if no other part of the contour lines is making sense to you, this part hopefully does. And then we've got like these big shadows across the side of the mushroom. Those are also going to be following the path of these contours. And you can see little ridges and details like that that are also going to follow the contours. So having this understanding of the contours is going to help you just get the value looking like it actually looks. And if you want to be really exact here, we've got this upward curve on the horizontal axis all the way up until about right here. There's like a equator line, and then it bulges and it curves down and out, because my eye level when I took the picture was about right here. So since my eye was right here, it kind of gives us a little equator line to those contours. All right, any questions about contour lines or sketching these mushrooms to get an understanding of value and all that stuff before I move on? Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my watercolor paper and start to set up for our painting. All right, and since I'm using a bigger piece of watercolor paper, I'm gonna tape it in a way that gives me a frame that's pretty similar to the other size. Looks like that was 9 by 12 that I was using before. I might just set that right there for a second, just to do a little eyeball measure of where I want to tape this down. But you should use your full page. I just want it to fit within my Zoom screen here. So if you kind of hover half on and half off the edge of your paper like this, you'll get that nice clean line that you can then remove the tape and have that clean line. And I'll have that too. It's just not going to be at the edge of my paper. So I'm going to go just a little bit in here. And just using my cutting board, make sure I can get a mostly straight line there. And if you have a piece of masonite board or a drawing board or even a piece of cardboard, it's nice to tape this down directly to something like that, like I'm doing to my mat board, because then I can just take this off my desk and set it aside and be able to, come right back to it. If you have a workspace, like I know a lot of you do, that is not a dedicated workspace that's maybe like a kitchen table or shared workspace, sometimes it can be hard to, continue working on your projects, because if you have to take them completely down and put them away completely, then it's a hassle to pull them back out. So taping your paper down to a piece of masonite board, like you can go to Home Depot and get a big sheet of masonite board for really inexpensive. And that can work, to tape your projects down on and then just set them aside on like behind a piece of furniture or something and come right back to them whenever you can. All right, so I'm gonna zoom back in here just for the sake of things looking a little not looking weird with my weird taping job that I just did on here. Okay. So now I'm going to sketch the mushrooms again, and you are not going to be able to see my sketch because I'm going to sketch them so light that they are not going to show up on the Zoom. And this sketch is not intended to be seen. It's going to be covered up with paint. So it's okay that you can't see it. It's just my foundational sketch. That's why we did this sketch together, so that I could help you to be able to do your foundational sketch on your own. So I'm starting just the same way that I did on the little thumbnail sketch. I'm going to jump around and do my little half circles here for the placement of all of these mushrooms. See if I can squeeze all 5 of those big caps in there. And I would not even recommend using a 2B pencil like I am right here. I would use a lighter H pencil if you have one, or even an HB. That way, your lines are not gonna be distracting and easy to paint over and not getting in the way of your paint here. And you could even skip this step and you could do this more with just paint if you wanted to. We had that underpainting class with acrylic paint in February, where we talked about using paint, watered down paint and a paintbrush to kind of draw our underpainting in. That's also a great way to lay down an underpainting with gouache even, because it's just that first, it's just something to kind of guide you, and it's all going to be painted over later. So that's why I don't want my lines to be super dark here. One part of this sketch that maybe I could have zoomed in and talked about a little more is this one right here. There's this little, almost feels like a bite has been taken out of this one over here. This one kind of has a little cut out moment of it. Let's draw that together. I'm afraid that might give some people trouble. So I'm going to start with kind of a little triangle shape right here, and then I'm going to overlap it with another little triangle shape. And then I'm going to overlap it with another little triangle shape. So see how it kind of creates this, like we've got that same vortex in the middle. So this is like the start of the vortex. But then we have this little cutout moment here. So I can see there's like some ridges to it, maybe like that for the contours. I don't know, just understanding what the contours are doing on here will help you. It really is all about the light and the color and the value that we're going to put on this, that is going to describe all these moments, but understanding the contours just does not hurt. So just seeing how it kind of goes in and out right there around those little, what feels like a bite has been taken out, can definitely help. And then there's like this curve over, maybe added an extra ridge right here. Yeah, it's more like that. It's like you're looking in the side of a pool or a coffee mug right here. But then there's that little chunk that's been taken out of it. So hopefully that's helpful as you're sketching that one. But really just want to make sure we get those little triangles in there for later when we're painting it, because those little moments, those little details or imperfections on a still life item like this, they really make it feel more realistic when you have those little moments like that. Like you could just edit that out and just not put that in there and just draw it like it's a perfect mushroom cap. But adding that little imperfection moment is going to make it feel more three-dimensional and more realistic in the long run. So I'm not adding all those contour lines in as I'm sketching it. I'm just sketching the basic shapes. And I'm definitely adding in, you know, some details like that to help guide me through my painting process, so I don't forget to put that fun stuff in there. And I'm being mindful of like these moments where it kind of bulges out. And then we've got these little moments down here at the bottom, these little baby mushroom sprouts. And those are like little cylinders themselves. And they've got some interesting value happening. We don't have to put all of them in there, but definitely putting a few of them is gonna give us something interesting to add with our paint. And honestly, since we're using gouache, I can press down a little harder on my pencil with this sketch and go ahead. That's why I decided to go ahead and draw this sketch a little darker than I said I was going to as I'm working here, because I realized, oh, hey, we're going over it with gouache, which is so opaque. So I don't need to be able to erase these lines. We're gonna cover them up, and I can also do another fun trick here in just a bit to get rid of some of this extra graphite. Because even though I'm making my lines darker, I am not pressing down so hard that it's going into the surface of the paper. I'm still trying to keep my lines pretty light, so I should be able to erase them. My pressure is light, even though I'm really just doing that so that y'all can see my sketch a little better. Even though I said I was going to draw it too light for you to see. So just getting all these ridges in here. I am putting all of the mushrooms a little closer together than they appear in the photo. That way I can make them a little bigger. You could space them out if you want to be more accurate to the photo. With organic stuff like this, it doesn't have to look exactly like these mushrooms. There can be slight differences between our reference photo and our painting. We're just using these as guides, and having like some accuracy across some of these interesting moments on them is just gonna help it feel more like real mushrooms. But hopefully you don't have anybody who's gonna hold up your reference photo next to your painting and say, actually, that center mushroom is not that big or not that small or whatever. My kids tend to be my biggest critics when it comes to my artwork. My daughter especially loves to tell me when things are off and wrong. In fact, with this mushroom study, I asked her opinion several times. Should I add more, or was I done? I love getting her take on things. All right, I'm just adding in a few of these little book pages, as she calls them, to my sketch, and then maybe some of these like fun little cracks. Just things that I don't want to forget when I'm painting, that like, oh yeah, that was an interesting moment that I want to make sure to put in there. So like some of these darker values, moments, that's a good thing to illustrate. But we're gonna have our reference photos handy the whole time, so we shouldn't forget about this stuff, but put a few of those in. Okay, and on the last two, my favorite thing to say to my kids whenever they say something critical about my artwork, like, you painted those mushrooms bigger than they are in the reference photo. I'm like, your mom painted those mushrooms bigger than they were in the reference photo. They don't think it's funny either. They're like, you're my mom. Like, exactly. That's why it's funny. They didn't grow up in the 90s, so they don't think your mom jokes are very funny. Apparently, that is not a thing anymore with elementary students. Okay, so we've got the last mushroom here. This one's kind of touching that one. I want to at least get those moments where they're touching each other in there because that's a light issue. We don't want to have to fudge anything that's related to the light too much because that shadow is happening because this one is leaning over there. That's such a dramatic shadow. And things like that just make more sense when, you know, all those things are present in the drawing. Also, this is kind of covered up, so we don't want to have to imagine what's there. It's easier to just draw it more like it looks in the photo, even if I had to scoot it over a little or make it a little wider down here, although it is pretty wide. All right. Let me make sure I get my little vortex up here on this one. Okay, and then now these big shadows. So we definitely want to give the indication of where the shadows are on the side of the mushrooms, because that's going to affect our paint right away. And then any of these heavier shadows that you see, you know, go ahead and sketch some of those in, like this big shadow right here, just having that blocked off is going to help you so that you don't forget about it when we're putting our first washes in with the paint. There's this little weird moment. Actually, it's not weird in the actual photo itself. It's just weird in the one where I pulled them out of the background because that kind of took some of the background with it. But here it's just really black in between those shadows or in between those mushrooms. Okay, so yeah, we want to get the the shadows that are falling across the background in here as well. So this is where I'm shifting my attention from this photo to these so that I can see the background light. And actually it might be easier to just look at this untouched photo, although this one has my shadow in it. So we're mainly just looking at the shadow that's being cast by the mushrooms. Okay, so these big shadows that are being cast by the mushrooms. And over here on the right, it's a little less smaller. They're bigger in the middle. These two are the biggest shadows. Okay, so this is where I said it's important that we have, you know, that one touching this one because it's eclipsing the shadow too. We're only seeing that much of the shadow over there. And same thing here. So if you kind of spaced these out a little far away from each other, make sure that the shadow makes sense. So I think I kind of went ahead and sketched the side of this shadow, even though it's not visible like that, because I spaced them out a little farther apart here as well. So this just might be a tricky moment if you fudged a few things like I did to just making sure the shadows make sense. With this one, it kind of sticks up like this. Ooh, it's kind of I made it so close right here. So this is where having them touching, if they're touching, this is what I meant, because I don't like having to imagine what the light is doing. I feel like that will stand out in my drawing too much. Like if you spaced these out too far apart, then it wouldn't make sense why there's such a dark shadow like across this one, you know? So we need a shadow that falls all the way across here and then a little bit right there. It's going to be pretty black in between, pretty dark there. There's a shadow that falls across this little mushroom. And then over here on the right, we can make it a little thinner, but we still want that shadow and we want it to fall across that little mushroom. And then we want at least something that makes sense on this little one over here on the right. I'll show you my more finished, well, my finished one again, so that you can see how I resolved all those shadows, even though I changed some aspects of the spacing on this one as well. Okay, so that should be a good place to start our painting process. I'm gonna pull out my gouache now. And I'm going to have a extra piece of watercolor paper next to me. I'm gonna just use this little watercolor sketchbook that I have nearby. And I recommend if you have a little watercolor sketchbook that you use that, or just go ahead and tear out an extra page of your watercolor paper. And we're just gonna test some of our colors on this watercolor paper as this extra piece that you have off to the side, we'll test some of our colors before we add them to our painting. Make some room for all those things on my desk. All right. So we're gonna start with our background. And starting with the background is a great rule of thumb for any painting, because you know, if you work your way from the background forward, it's easier to make corrections. Like if we were to paint the mushrooms first and get some kind of detail on the mushrooms and then try to fill in our background around them, we might end up painting over some details on the mushrooms themselves whenever we try to put the background in. And then also there's going to be all these like little keyhole spaces in between. It's just easier to work your way from the background forward. All right, so now is when I have to decide, am I going to use the same colors as last time, or am I going to do something different? I'll probably just do the same thing because sometimes it's hard for me to like make decisions when I'm teaching on these classes. Okay, so let's take our big paintbrush and we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna do like a wet on wet thing here. We're also gonna make a wash first. So decide what color you want your background to be. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to be married to it because we're going to make it washy, and you can always do your second layer of the background a different color. So let's say you just want to do pink and then you're like, oh, I don't like pink. I want it to be blue. You could easily paint over pink with blue. But if you, because we're going to make it thin and washy. So really, the only thing you wouldn't be able to do is maybe, you know, change it to a lighter color later, but you could easily change it to something else. Okay, so I'm going to just go with pink. And I'm not going to get too creative here. I'm going to take some of my magenta pink here. The other thing I forgot to do was spritz this. Forgot this. Jelly gouache likes it when you spritz it before you get started. Got my little spray bottle here. I'm just gonna spritz these cakes to get them nice and moistened. Oh, I should have filled up that little water bottle ahead of time. Hang on. I'm just spritzing my gouache cakes off camera here. All right, and then I'm going to take some of this magenta pink, magenta color, and the beautiful thing about gouache is that we can treat it like watercolor, or we can treat it like gouache, which is very opaque and very thick. And we had that whole Gouache 101 class back in January that you can refer back to if you missed that, where I go over all the fun kind of brushstroke techniques that you can play around with to get comfortable with the gouache. I'm just taking that color and I'm really watering it down. I'm going to make a nice little puddle of pigment here, just like I'm painting with watercolor, making a nice little wash. And I might even use, I happen to have a pipette right here. I'm just going to take some water in my pipette and water it down even more like that. So really washy. The washier, the better. Why is it good to start with a wash with gouache? Well, there are many reasons. One, when you start with a wash, you can control how thick you go with your next layers. If you start out really thick with the gouache, then you kind of have to stay that thick throughout the painting. But if you start out thin, for one, you can let the layers dry really easily before you move on to the next layer, and it's really good to work one layer at a time. Okay, so I watered down my color that I'm going to use. You use whatever color you want. You want to use blue or green or brown or whatever red background you might want to have. Okay, and then my water is actually pink now, but I want to just paint the entire background with just water. Okay, the pink is not really showing up. So I'm going to take my flat brush and we're going to paint the entire background with just water. Okay, also, actually, I meant to do something before that. I'm going to take my eraser and just take the top layer of my drawing off now. I meant to do that before. I really only drew this dark so that y'all could see my drawing. Just going to take off some of this extra graphite. I just don't need it. And it's not likely to interfere too much, but we are going to get pretty light on these mushrooms. So there might be some transparent moments that if the graphite was too dark, it could peek through. Although I should be able to easily cover it up with some opaque white since the gouache is so opaque, but better safe than annoyed later with the graphite. So I'm just erasing that top layer of graphite because I don't need it. It's getting in some of my water that I already put down. Some of my eraser shavings. But you might do the same if you drew too dark or you started adding some value with your pencil. I recommend taking the side of your eraser and just taking some of that off because we just don't need it. It's just there so that we can have a guide and, you know, that's good enough, nice and light like that. Okay, then I'm taking my water. It's got a little bit of pink in it already. And some eraser shavings. And it's okay if I accidentally go into the mushrooms here. This is why we paint the background first. It's because it's easier to fix little issues like that on the background than it is, or I mean on the mushrooms, than it is to fix the background, because the background is going to be so uniform. It's just like trying to fix a little moment in the space in between leaves on a tree that's the sky. It's easier to just paint the whole sky first and then not touch it again as you move forward in painting. I'm painting the whole thing with water, just the background and in between all of the mushrooms. And then we're going to drop in, and I'm also not painting the shadows. I'm not painting the shadows and I'm not painting the mushrooms. I'm just painting the space around the shadows and around the mushrooms with water. And yeah, going super thin and washy right off the bat is going to give us so much more control over all of these layers. We're going to be able to just manipulate our layers easier by starting with a wash. And I have taught some in-person gouache classes lately at the art museum where I teach here in Austin, and some people just really get attached to how thick the gouache is and they want to go super thick with it, no matter how many times I say, you know, starting with a wash will give you more control. But then I always like to say, I'm not the boss of you. You do whatever you want. So, you know, if you're already going thick and not listening to me with this watery, washy business, I accidentally painted right there. That's a mushroom. That's not a space in between a mushroom. But this little space is the space in between. Okay. There's that one little keyhole moment there. And then on these, it's actually a shadow right there. All right, and now we're ready to drop in our really washy color. So I'm going to start just spreading this all around, this pink. And it's going to bleed and kind of pool up a little bit. And that's fine. We're just getting a layer of a background going. And by doing the water first, that's going to help the gouache be nice and kind of flat and uniform. Although if we have any streaks, that's not the end of the world either. In fact, once we start getting thicker with the gouache, it's really hard to paint with gouache and not have some visible brush strokes. So hopefully that doesn't bother you. I had a person in my last in-person gouache class that just really did not like those visible brush strokes. And I was like, maybe gouache is not the medium for you then if you don't like those visible brush strokes, because it's really hard to not have visible brush strokes with a medium like this. But we can limit those by doing what we're doing here. And also I'm moving them pretty quickly, trying to keep it nice and even and uniform as much as possible. Jumping around. You might have to stop and look at your reference photo here if you get a little lost in between your sketch and you forget where the background is. And if you accidentally, paint on top of a mushroom, you can just try to grab it out with the paper towel. All right. And then even though I'm doing it right now, resist the urge to like go back in and start doing another layer here, even though I know it looks like I'm painting another layer. I'm mostly just grabbing it where it kind of made a little pool and spreading it around a little bit. And I'm kind of filling in some of the little cracks that I missed with that first pass. Okay, so that is the first layer for the background. So now we want to let that dry. And while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm going to actually move this all aside for a second. And we're going to talk about the colors that we're seeing on the mushrooms themselves. And I'm going to kind of do a little test palette here. I always joke in my water media classes to people, let me know if you need something to do while you're waiting for a layer to dry, because people have a really hard time letting a layer of water media dry. So I'm like, you can, like if you're watching this later on YouTube, you might be tempted to just go ahead and put another layer on that background. Don't do it. Set it aside. Do what I'm doing right here and like, let's, make the little test palette for some of these other colors that we're seeing. Or you can scroll on your phone and look at some social media. You can go for a 5-10 minute walk. You can call a friend. You can watch another YouTube video. I don't know. But let your layers dry. It's going to be so much easier to manipulate. Also, gouache dries differently than it looks wet. It's always going to look different wet versus dry. The lighter values will dry a little bit darker, and the darker values will dry lighter. In fact, I'm going to write that down. These are like my main gouache takeaways. This is what I wrote on the board at the end of my last gouache class. And this is why I made this a 2-part class, so we can wait for a layer to dry before we move on. You could use a blow dryer, but we don't need to do that. So main gouache takeaways. It looks different. Wet versus dry. And if you want to write down dark values, dry lighter, light values, dry darker. I know that's confusing and weird, but that's just the way it is. Okay, so let each layer dry before you move on to the next layer. And then the last thing is kind of my top 3 takeaways here is that if you think about drawing techniques, They work great with painting with gouache. Okay, so like that class that I mentioned on the limes, the value class on understanding contour lines, the next part of that class was understanding value shading techniques using those limes. And you can find that class on YouTube by just searching value shading techniques using pen and ink. You should be able to find it. If you search my name and value shading techniques, you should be able to find that class. And if you can't, feel free to email me and I'll send you the link to it if you can't find it. I forgot to ask you'll say to grab that link beforehand to share that with you all. But those value shading techniques, those drawing techniques with pen and ink, those work great to use. And in the gouache painting 101 class, you know, we kind of sat there and did like stippling dots with the paintbrush and the gouache. We did hatching lines or cross hatching, and we did scribbling. All of those techniques when you're painting with gouache will give you the optimal effect that you might be looking for with the paint. So those are my three main takeaways. Let each layer dry. It's going to look different, wet versus dry, and use those drawing with pen and ink value shading techniques. So like, I mean, we'll get into it more in part 2 next week, but we're going to be using like hatching lines, and we're going to be using like scribbling lines and so forth here, and maybe a little stippling. Okay, so let's make some of these colors that are going on the mushrooms themselves real quick. I happen to have a set that has like this ochre color and this brown color. But if you don't have those colors in your gouache set, you might use whatever you have that is similar. Well, let's just paint a little swatch of a brown. And if you have to make a brown using like a primary set, then I would go back to one of the color theory classes. I definitely don't have the time to you know, to talk about making a brown from primary colors, but we had a class using acrylic paint on color theory, 2-part class that could be really helpful with that. But I'm just going to take this ochre color and I'm going to add a little bit of this lighter brown burnt sienna color to it. And then I'll paint a little swatch of that and see what I think. That's definitely a good warm brown tone for our mushrooms here. And then maybe even that ochre color by itself. And then we definitely want a gray. So I'm going to take my white first to a separate part of my palette, and then get just a touch of black. So I'll have the black kind of off to the side. I don't want it to be too dark gray. I'm looking for a light gray here. And I'll paint a little swatch of my gray. And it's good to paint swatches of these colors so that you can, you know, see how they look on the paper. They might look different they're going to look different on the paper than they do on the palette. They're going to look different dry versus wet. So that's another reason it's good to do that off to the side. And then maybe even water some of these colors down and see what they look like when they're, you know, a lighter, more diluted value. We also want this color, but like with the gray. So like add a little bit of gray or add some of this sepia color to your gray, and then paint a little swatch of that. That's definitely one tone that we're going to use. All right, let's see what else. I think that's pretty good. That's pretty good to get us started here with like our initial washes that we're about to add. Maybe let's water down this brown color by itself. Actually, I'm going to add a darker brown to the lighter brown. So it's like a burnt sienna, and then this like Van Dyke brown. It's just, these are just names I'm just randomly giving them based on how they look. I have the little thing over here that tells me what these colors are actually called, but I'm adding some darker brown to that lighter sepia, and then that gives me that tone. Okay, and then we want all of these to be washy versions of themselves. So I'm going to add some water to them, because again, we want to manipulate these layers. We want to start with a nice light wash of all of these colors.
Adrienne, while we wait for it to dry, there is a question that might be good to answer.
Okay.
So Cecilia asked, what should I do if my gouache comes out of the tube very thick and gloopy? Would it be a pigment issue, or what can she do to improve the consistency?
Just take like make a little puddle of water and then just touch your gouache to it to try to water it down to get started here. Yeah, some gouache just does come out, you know, you might have to just work into it with the paintbrush to get it to be more fluid, but you should be able to still water it down. You'll just have to work into it a little more with your paintbrush and some water to get it to be washier like that. All right. I'm gonna set this aside now and go back. We really don't need our background to be completely dry to start adding a layer to the mushrooms. I was just worried if we started doing it while it was all too wet, then it could start to bleed into the background, and we don't want that to happen. So you could do another layer on your background if it was completely dry before moving on to this, but if we're gonna go super washy with this layer on the mushrooms, so you know, then we'll let that dry and then do another layer on the background, but that's gonna have to be next week because we're already running low on time here. But I just wanna get a first layer on some of these mushrooms here together. And these colors don't even have to be perfectly matching right here. So I'm going to use kind of that grayish brown color. These really blend together. I'm going to use that and like the more sepia one. So just start to put in some of these values across like the side of the mushrooms. I gotta move some things around on my desk here. So like right here is where it's kind of a little more grayish. I'm looking at the one where I made it warmer, where I added the filter and made it more sepia. But there's still this like grayish brown across those bigger shadows on the side. And there's like this little moment here. Just bouncing around with this kind of grayish brown that I made and seeing where that might be appropriate to start to wash in. that color. And if you put it somewhere that you're like, oh no, that's not really where I want that to go, you can add a little bit of water to it and then just pull it right out with a paper towel. So that's the other reason it's nice to start out washy, is because then you can really, you can just control what you're doing a little better. So I'm just jumping around and just seeing where it looks appropriate to put that color. And I'm keeping it super thin and washed out so that I can easily pull it back out if that's not where I want it. And then we can also go ahead and do, we should have done this already. I'm going to make a little wash of black as well. So, but I'm actually going to make it more dark brown than black, just because I feel like those shadows, well, I guess I did make them pretty black in the end, but I start out with just a nice dark brown wash. Just taking a dark brown, adding some water. I can get a really watery shadow in here. It really doesn't take that much pigment, that much paint. You want more water than paint here for these washes. And I can go ahead and fill in those shadows as well. And they might bleed into the mushrooms, so maybe I should have waited until what I just did to the mushrooms dried. But if I leave a little gap, if I leave a little space right there, nope, it still bled. There's another reason to do these thin washes right away is it just breaks the ice and like helps you visualize the finished product a lot sooner. Like having this thin wash on these shadows, I feel like is really important, especially because I just keep getting confused when I look at my sketch about where the shadows are. So if I go ahead and fill them in with this nice little wash, then it's really obvious where the shadows are. And then the next time I do a layer on the background, I'm less likely to accidentally fill in a shadow. But yeah, we're just going to do one thin layer of wash on the mushrooms, and then we're going to do a final layer on the background next week. So if you do jump ahead, the only thing, or the next thing I would advise that you do if you're going to jump ahead is to put a nice thick final layer on your background. Like do that as early as possible so that you don't get too far on the mushrooms and then have to do a final layer on the background in between, a more developed mushroom painting. Maybe, well, no, there's only 4 minutes. I was gonna say, maybe we could go ahead and put a next layer on the background together, but that'll just be the first thing we do in part 2. But we're just about at the stage that I was with the part 1 photo that was used to advertise the class. I guess we could go in here real quick and add some of this sepia color, some of these little cap areas. And we're just getting a base layer going. Nothing has to be perfect here. So really water it down and stretch it out. You can maybe even start to like blend some of these things together. But if you feel like, oh, I went too dark, go ahead and just pull it out with a paper towel. Because it's so thin and washy that you should be able to easily control what's happening. We're just breaking the ice. And getting a little bit of color on every part of it, so we can easily visualize where we're going to go next. And if you accidentally fill it in a place where it's going to be a really light area, you can add some water and pull it out with a paper towel like I just did. I'm like, oh, that's actually a really light moment, but I just filled it in with that darker. But this really helps me to start to see it, and I'm following those contours. Sometimes I forget to say that when I get in painting mode. That's why I wanted to spend that time at the beginning of the class talking about it, because sometimes I go into autopilot and I forget to mention how I'm following those contours as I'm adding this color. So I'm following that curve. I'm not just painting it in willy-nilly. So not that I think it's good to compare yours to mine, but if you are doing that and you're like, why is hers already looking rounded and mine's looking flat, then it could be that you're not following those contours with your paint. So I'm always being mindful of those curves and making my brush strokes follow those three-dimensional curves that we spent so much time talking about. Oop, that's a lot darker than I want it to be. Well, maybe not. It gets pretty dark in there. But I'm not ready to go that dark yet. I'm going to build up to it. All right. So just getting those first little washy layers going. That's a pretty good place to stop. All right. Maybe we'll go just a couple minutes over here if that's okay. And I'd love to see some of y'all's examples. So if you want to hold up where you are in your painting process so far, and you'll say can spotlight you. Oh, look at that, Sarah. That's really nice. Yeah, that's a nice soft wash you got going. And there's Barbara. All right, nice and light with those washes. Oh, that's really nice, Goudy. I like how you've got that strong contrast already going with the shadows, and I'm feeling the 3 dimensions. Wow, you've come so far in such a short time, or maybe you were just misrepresenting your drawing skills, because now that you're starting to share what you're doing, I'm impressed. All right, there's Jen. That's lovely. On a smaller scale, those are so cute. Yeah, I'm really feeling the 3 dimensions and roundedness to that, Jen. And this is Cecilia. Oh yeah, those have a nice round shape happening. They already feel nice and 3-dimensional coming away from that background. All right. Oh, I love that green background you got so far. That's really lovely and soft. Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing where you are so far, and I'm excited about this one. We just have to wait 2 weeks to get back to it. So we'll see you back here on Wednesday in 2 weeks for part 2 of this class in April. Thank you all so much and have a great evening. Bye.